All right, so tonight we're going to talk about human psychology, and this is one of the things that turns out to be kind of a missing piece of a lot of health programs, where people learn about what they should eat and how they should exercise and all that, but then the actual doing of it and the developing the motivation and changing habits. Have you ever noticed that habits sometimes are difficult to change? Yeah? I'm not the only person that's noticed that. And furthermore, have you noticed that bad habits are very hard to break, but good habits are pretty easy to break? Have you ever noticed that? Have you ever wondered why that is?
Go away by themselves.
Yeah, good habits just kind of go away by themselves if you're not careful, right? So tonight we're going to talk about that and hopefully kind of set the stage for ourselves. And I'm doing this purposely first. I know I've already told you what to eat and things to do and not do, but before we get into really helping you to figure out what your long-term plan is going to be and how you need to structure that, we're going to talk about this. And so it starts with just a basic understanding of what it means to be a human being. And so the first thing is we notice that we have thoughts and feelings. Does anybody notice that? Yeah, okay. So I'm going to draw here on the board. There's a place here for you guys to fill in the diagram that I'm going to draw it however you like. So if we put thoughts and feelings, and if you can't read my writing, ask Roberto. He's a nurse. He should be able to make out my writing. Doctor's handwriting. I actually used to have fair handwriting, and then when I went to medical school, it just...
That's not bad.
So I try to make it legible, even when I finished medical school. Actually, I think it was when I was a resident. One of my attending doctors said something to the effect of, when you're on the witness stand, it's really embarrassing if you can't read your own writing. So you should at least be able to read your own writing. And so I've tried to stick with that. Anyway, so thoughts and feelings. What are some feelings that we might have? Anger, okay. Happiness.
Fear.
Yes. Anxiety.
Hopelessness.
And I'm going to put up here joy. Love. How about love? Is love a feeling?
Sure.
Sure, you give me. And there's probably a lot more. We could go on and on. But that gives us a fairly good idea. What about thoughts? We don't really usually categorize our thoughts quite as much, but what was that?
Good ones and bad ones.
Good thoughts and bad thoughts. Okay, maybe. Well, since you mentioned that, I'm going to say about feelings. A lot of people categorize feelings as good and bad, but I think feelings are just feelings. And we have all kinds of feelings. What's good or bad is a result, like what happens after, what do we do with them? But
I think it's the thoughts that come from the feeling that
there's a definite connection. So thoughts, I'm going to categorize this as, I'll put down here are memories.
And ideas.
Ideas, plans, those sort of things, right? Now, if we and we're talking about human beings, if we think of this as sort of a continuum, what would be kind of on this end of the continuum? What other kind of feelings could we have that we didn't mention yet?
Depression, hopelessness.
I'm sorry?
Depression or hopelessness.
Yeah, I think that's a little more complex. But, so I'm talking about,
physical feelings,
oh, there we go. So physical feelings, like,
touch,
well, we all experienced some hunger this last week, right? Maybe some today. So hunger is a feeling. So I'm going to say down here, this is the body, right? So we have bodily sensations, or sometimes we call them feelings. Sometimes these kind of feelings we're talking about more emotions, right? And here we're talking about more physical sensations or feelings. But they're kind of connected, aren't they? Like hunger, for example. Hunger is definitely a physical sensation, but it also has an emotional and mental component to it very often, right? So other bodily sort of feelings we might put down here, pain, and we could also put down here pleasure, right? Although pleasure certainly can be mental and emotional as well, but there's certain physical sensations. You know, we can talk about eating, you know, tasting good food, sexual pleasure, other types of physical things, you know, enjoying the sunshine on a spring day when it's nice and warm and you just feel that sunshine, right? So there's all sorts of physical feelings that we have. And then what if we go kind of on the other end of this continuum? What would we put up here? I know you like this is a whole new thing. We're just kind of, so I put up here spiritual, right? It's kind of the opposite end of the continuum. It's still all part of us, and it's all integrated as one thing. But often we talk about our body and our spirit as separate things. We know they're not really separate, but they're kind of different ideas about different parts of us. Does that make sense? And so here, the parts of our spirit, I would put reason. Although some people would put that here under thought. I think maybe it's kind of some of both. I think the ability to reason is a spiritual thing that God has given us. But most definitely our conscience. And worship I would put up here. In a very real sense, when we worship, that's a spiritual thing. And it certainly involves all of us. But there's a special sense in which these are kind of spiritual things. Okay? Everybody following me so far? Now, when it comes to decision making, how do we make decisions? But now we have this kind of framework. So I'm going to give you an example. And so imagine for a moment with me that you are you're working in a hospital. You're a resident doctor there. You know why they call them residents? Because they pretty much live in the hospital. They reside at the hospital. You know, they let you out for a few hours at a time to go socialize with your family for a few hours, but you're pretty much at the hospital most of the time. So, you know, it's you started work at about 5 in the morning, and you round on the patients, and then you go to clinic and you have lectures and more clinic, and then you round on the patients again, and you're on call, so you're working overnight, taking care of sick people, answering the calls from the nurses, running around doing all this work. And now it's 3 a.m. in the morning, and you come to the nurses' station, and what do they have at the nurses' station but there is a chocolate cake. And I don't know if you guys just had the same thought that I had, but the last time I had anything to eat was, dinner at 6 o'clock last night, and I've been working all night. How long is that? That's quite a few hours, and I'm hungry. I'm all tired. I don't want to offend the nurses. They're wonderful people, and now some of you guys, you know what I'm talking about. This is that, like.
And I deserve it because I've worked so hard.
Yes, I do. So here we have hunger and desire. We might say desire instead of pleasure, right? That desire. And then what else happens right after I see that cake? I'm like, oh, I should. Well, the other part of me, probably somewhere up in this part here, says something like, well, you just decided to get on a healthier plan, and you've been working a lot of hours, and you know that sugar slows down your immune system, so you really probably shouldn't have that right now. But this part of me is like, but I deserve it. You don't understand. I've been working hard, and I have to keep my brain fed well so that I can think clearly, and I deserve that. This is really good. And so there's this back and forth thing that happens, right? So I don't know if you all like chocolate cake, but can you all at least relate to that idea that there's something, and you have this little back and forth in your head? You deserve it, do it. No, you really shouldn't. Yeah, go ahead. No, yes, no, right? We've all experienced that multiple times in our life over multiple different things, okay? And I just use chocolate cake because I find that like 95% of people can relate directly to what I'm talking about. The other 5% just, I don't know what's wrong with them, but anyway. So let's play out the scenario. So if I decide to go with my hunger and my desire, and I decide to eat a piece of chocolate cake, okay? So I go over there, I'm chit-chatting with the nurses. I gotta tell you, it's always good to be on friendly terms with the nurses. I learned that very, very early in my career. Am I right? Yeah, you don't want the nurses mad at you. So you're chatting with the nurses, you get a piece of cake, and you're sitting there eating, and oh, it tastes so good. You get that little rush of, endorphins and dopamine from the sugar that triggers that in your brain. You're like, oh, this is really good. Who made this one? Like, thanks for bringing it in and sharing and all this and chatting about whatever. So it feels really good, right? Feels good. But then what happens probably about 10 minutes later after I went on to the next thing or whatever, and now I'm sitting there, what's happening to me? I'm not feeling so great. I'm not feeling so great. And there's several reasons why. So first of all, I'm probably feeling some guilt, right? Because my conscience told me that wasn't really the best thing to do right now, okay? So, and don't get me wrong, I'm not one of those people that thinks eating chocolate is a sin or anything like that, okay? But I'm just saying, you all know what I'm talking about. The circumstances, it wasn't the appropriate time and place and all that. So when my conscience is being ignored, then I'm going to start feeling guilt, and I'm probably also, maybe not in 10 minutes, but probably within that, a half hour, I get that little sugar spike, and then what happens after the spike? Crash. And we'll explain that when we talk about carbohydrates. There's a specific physiologic reason why that happens. But you don't really feel good at that point. So you feel bad physically, and you feel bad with guilt. And when you feel bad, when I feel bad, what do you want most when you feel bad? You want to feel good. When's the last time that I felt good?
When you ate chocolate cake?
When I ate the chocolate cake. And I know where there's more. So I can go back over there and say, hey, such and such about this patient. Oh, there's still some cake. I'll have another piece. I won't ask who's done that before. But you know what I'm talking about, don't you? And so when you feel bad, you want to feel good. And so this creates this little feedback loop. Okay? You all understand what we're talking about? And some people go so far as to just eat the whole cake. And this has happened if you've ever been on a diet. I mean, it's a very common thing where people, they mess up on their diet, and then what's the little voice say? Oh, you mess up, you might as well go ahead and just eat the whole thing, whatever it is. The whole bag of chips or the whole box of Oreos. They even advertise it that way, don't they? You can't eat just one. If you can't eat just one, should you be eating it at all? Maybe. I don't know. That's an interesting question. What do we call this cycle?
Guilt, pleasure cycle?
We could call it that. The pleasure guilt cycle. Psychologists call it an addiction. Theologians call it a sin. There's really it's just two different words for the same thing. All right? So bad habits that we get into, they always, this is the pattern, always. Like, I haven't come up with any exceptions. There's always some kind of reward, right? Even if it's just, I've met heroin addicts, and they say, I just want to feel normal. And I have to get another dose of, another hit of heroin just to feel normal. They're not even trying to feel good anymore. They're just trying to feel not bad, right? Because it might start out with pleasure and feeling high and awesome, and that's all wonderful. But the more the cycle goes, the harder it is. And pretty soon, trying to feel good gets to be just, I just want to feel normal. And then I just want to not feel horrible. But they try harder and harder, and it works less and less. And it's not just with heroin, it's with everything in life. Okay, everything that we do, whenever we're violating our conscience and we're doing something that's not in harmony with God's plan for us. Now, thankfully, since this was just a imaginary exercise, we can have a do-over. So let's rewind, go back. Here I am, I'm walking up to the nurse's station. I see the chocolate pie. I have this little debate in my head, but this time I'm going to choose to go with my reason, conscience. I don't know, sometimes it's hard to tell the difference, right?
Yeah.
But maybe we don't have to. Maybe they're supposed to be together, right? So this time I decide, no, I'm not going to eat that right now. For all the reasons that we could talk about. How does it feel to deny yourself something that you really desire?
It's a struggle.
Right at that moment, it doesn't really feel good, does it? It feels like, I'm missing out on something. And what if they eat it all and then I don't get any? or, there's all sorts of things, but it's hard. It's hard to deny part of ourself that has made a really strong case of why I deserve to have that. So I'm going to say here, it feels bad, maybe, or at least it's hard, right? Maybe it's not always really bad, but at least it's really hard sometimes. But then I go on with work, and a few minutes later, how am I feeling?
Good.
I'm feeling good. Why?
You don't feel guilt, and you don't get that.
Yes. Yeah, it's not messing with my blood sugar. I'm not feeling guilty for going against my conscience and my reason. I feel like I might even feel almost a little proud of myself, like, hey, I made a good decision right there, if I think about it that much, right? I like to put up here peace. But you could put whatever fits for you. But I feel like the absence of guilt is peace. The scripture even says that. If we're at peace with God, our conscience is clean. That's good. And so this also becomes kind of a feedback loop, because the more you feel good and at peace, the more that gives support to making good choices. Right? But like we said, this doesn't have the same sort of power of trapping us that this does. You understand what I mean? So like, you can eat apples, and apples are good for you and they taste good, and you feel peace. But if you don't eat an apple, it doesn't give you withdrawal symptoms. Like if you don't have your Coke or, whatever. You understand what I mean? So this cycle here tries to trap us. And this one here is how we can have a life of freedom. So another piece that I didn't put on here yet is, what is it that actually decides which way we're going to go?
The will.
It's our will. I'll put that here. Willpower, or we could call it the power of choice. Right? So this is actually what decides. So really all of these parts of us kind of show up to the king, willpower, sitting on the throne, and say, oh, hey, this is a good idea, we should do this. And this part of you says, well, here's a reason why we should do this. And so all the different parts of you present their ideas to the will, and the will makes the final choice. The problem is sometimes the will kind of hands over that choice to another part of us. That's what a habit is. When you've already made, if the will agrees with the bodily craving time after time after time, it's just like a foregone conclusion already. You don't even have to think about it. Have you noticed that? Sometimes you don't even... I've literally had people who... I had a guy who quit smoking, and he really struggled, but he quit smoking, came to one of our stop smoking programs. He did really great. 6 months later, so that was the beginning of the year. So he woke up on the July 5 and he realized that he was smoking. And he's like, what am I doing? How did I get to be smoking? And he thought back, and well, on the 4th of July, he went to a barbecue and had a few beers and was hanging out with the guys, and somebody handed him a cigarette and he started smoking it. He didn't even think about it, right? Because for so long, this had been happening. Okay, and so you interrupted that for a little while, but you didn't have enough barriers to keep that sort of automatic. It's not really automatic, but it feels like it's automatic. Just like when you're driving a car, if you've been driving a stick shift for, looks like most of you here know how to drive a stick shift, I'm just guessing. Is that right? Okay. So, I mean, when you've been doing that for a few years, can you just drive down the road and think about something else and not even pay attention to shifting? Yeah. But, I mean, it's almost like it's a subconscious choice. Like, it's still a choice for you to shift. You're not actually shifting automatically, but it's subconscious because you've made that choice so many times, you don't need to consciously think about it anymore. And so many of our habits are that way. We make choices without conscious effort, like a lot of times. And that can be a good thing. If you had to consciously think about how to shift and use the clutch and the gas and the brake every single time, it would be horribly frustrating.
Exhausting.
Yeah, it'd be exhausting. Never mind if you had to try to think about how to breathe at the same time.
Keep your heart going.
Or keeping your heart going, or walking, okay? Walking is like we all had a little experience with walking the last couple of days, and I'm challenging you to think about it. But one of the good things about us is we have the ability to walk without thinking about it normally, right? So, all right. Now, I want to add a couple of pieces here. Let me look at my notes for a second. Yeah, okay. So, since we're talking about spirit and the body, I'm going to suggest for you guys to read a passage of Scripture, Romans chapter 7 and chapter 8. The most relevant part is like the second half of chapter 7 and the first half of chapter 8. But read all of, both chapters, you'll get the full context. What do we know about that? If you remember, that's where Paul, the Apostle Paul, says, I do the things I don't want to do. And the things I don't want to do, I do. And if I don't want to do it, but I'm still doing it, then it's not me that's doing it. It's, what did he say? Sin that's living in me. So he was describing this cycle right here, where we get trapped and we do things that we know we shouldn't do, we don't want to, but we keep doing them anyway. So I like to go through this with a lot of my patients, and some of them are totally not open to spiritual things. And so they get this much. But the reality is we know that there's God and there's a devil that's out to get us. So how does the devil approach us? How does Satan try to get us to mess up?
The big sign says, "Here I am." Oh, he doesn't?
Very rarely. I won't say never, never, but that's not his usual approach.
Correct.
His usual approach
Sneaky.
is to say to your desire or your pain or something like, hey, you deserve this. Try this out. This will work better for you. Like Eve, you don't have to struggle through this whole thing. If you just eat this fruit, you'll be like God. Look, it worked for me and I can talk, right? Shortcuts.
Smart.
Shortcuts. And this is what we find. Every single sin, every single addiction is a shortcut. Trying to get maybe a legitimate thing, but not in the right way. Right? Is it a legitimate thing to desire to have yummy food to eat? Absolutely. Is the best way of doing that stopping at McDonald's and Baskin Robbins. Probably not the best way, right? And if we fall into that habit, then it becomes a big, big problem for us. So the devil's always working to what Paul called the carnal nature, or the carnal is just a old word for flesh, right? The body. And what does God appeal to? God appeals to our spirit, our reason, our conscience. And then we have a choice to make. So we can put our will on the side of God, or our will on the side of Satan. Now, we don't like to say that. So, if you don't want Satan in there, you could just say me, right? A selfishness, but it's the same. It's the same thing, because that's Satan's way, is don't worry about everybody else. Just do what feels good for you, because you deserve it. You deserve a break today.
Or you need it.
Yeah. So, a couple of other pieces here. Let's talk about guilt for just a moment. What is guilt?
A feeling you made the wrong choice.
Condemnation from your conscience.
Okay, so I heard it's a feeling. Is that true? Is guilt a feeling? I'm not saying it is or isn't. I just want you to think about it for a second. Is guilt a feeling? So it's not a trick question. I might let you know when I do ask trick questions sometimes, but that's not one of them. Yes, guilt is a feeling. Even your dog feels guilty sometimes. You can tell by how, right? It's a feeling. Even animals can feel that feeling sometimes, I think, or something like it anyway.
It looks like it at least.
So, but yeah, we can feel guilt. Is that all there is to guilt? No, there's more. It's more than just a feeling.
Remorse.
It's guilt can also be a reality, right? So, if we're going to talk about it in a legal case, if someone's charged with killing someone else, well, either they did or they didn't, right? And if they did, they're actually guilty. Whether or not they feel guilty is a different thing. There are people who do horrible things and don't feel guilt. Does that mean that they're not guilty? No. So guilt is a feeling, but it's also a metaphysical reality. Are we okay with calling it that? It's a reality in the ultimate spiritual sense, right? Okay. And sometimes those things don't match up. So sometimes people are actually guilty and they don't feel guilty. And the opposite is also sometimes true.
Yeah.
Sometimes people feel guilty, but they're not actually guilty.
And that could be their thoughts then. That's the thought then.
Yeah, the feelings, the thought, the emotion. I mean, it can be, and sometimes people's conscience can be messed up and cause all sorts of problems. Well, that's beyond the scope of this particular talk. The reason I want to point this out is because I have found, it's quite common, people who struggle with health problems, and it's not just me, there's actually a lot of research around this idea. Very, very many people that have a lot of health problems are victims of childhood trauma. And so this is a classic thing. An abuser abuses a child, and then who do they blame for that abuse? They blame the child. So if you're a child you're 5 years old, somebody hurt you and they said it was your fault. Well, it's not surprising that sometimes people feel guilty. But they didn't do anything wrong, but they feel guilty. And Satan uses that feeling to start this cycle. Before the child even knows what's going on, they're getting caught up in this cycle. Yeah, this is part of being in a sinful world, a sinful, fallen human nature. We all have it. We've all inherited that from our parents. And so very often we see people getting trapped into this when they don't even know what's going on. They didn't choose it, it just happens to them. So I won't go on and on about that, but it's an important thing to recognize. And well, I will tell one more little story about that. I had a patient a number of years ago who was, I want to say she was 30-something, late 30s, very overweight, struggling to lose weight, and she just found herself eating. And so I worked with her for a while, number of months. We were talking, and at one time, I don't know exactly how we got in this conversation, but we started talking about her childhood, and when she was telling me how she would eat ice cream. She would get up at night and just eat ice cream. And she knew she shouldn't. She knew it wasn't good for her, but she did it anyway. And so at some point I was like, whoa, when's the first time you remember eating ice cream? She's like, oh, my grandma used to feed me ice cream. Oh. You liked your grandma? Yeah. My grandma was good. She would feed me ice cream after Grandpa did bad things to me. So, see, this is what I mean about if we just tell people what to do, that's not sufficient to help them actually change. We got to start to understand the deeper things that drive us, and sometimes there's horrible things like that. So for her, after she had never made that connection before, and I don't know. I think it was the Holy Spirit prompting me to ask a question or something. But after she made that connection, she's like, "Oh, I don't have to eat ice cream to feel loved anymore. I'm an adult now. I'm not in that situation." And then I think she actually, this is a while ago, I'm trying to remember. She might have even had a therapist that had never figured that out for her. So now, once we figured that out, go talk to your therapist some more about that. But anyway, so what's the best way to deal with guilt? We're getting to the important point. This applies for all of us. And not all of us were abused as children, although I would dare say most of us were. But what's the best way to deal with guilt?
Bury it.
Hmm?
Bury it.
Bury it?
He's kidding.
Yeah,
He's kidding.
that works really well, right? You bury it under a pint of chocolate ice cream.
And cake.
And cake. Chocolate cake. And vanilla ice cream's good with chocolate cake too. Or anyway, no, that doesn't work. I mean, it sometimes feels like it works temporarily, right? You can bury it, forget about it, shove it somewhere under the rug or whatever.
You don't know what it's doing.
I had a patient who came to me and said, "Hey, doc, you gotta help me out. I've been going to this therapist, and I was feeling guilty about all this stuff, and the therapist told me that there's no reason for me to feel guilty. I shouldn't feel guilty. And now I feel guilty for feeling guilty." This actually happened. It's a real thing. So a lot of therapists have no idea how to deal with guilt other than bury it or just pretend it's not there or don't believe in it. But we all feel it and we know that it's real. So what's another way of dealing with guilt that might work better than burying it?
Ask forgiveness from Christ.
Forgiveness. Forgiveness is the way to deal with guilt. So, and as Christians, we know that that's what Christianity is all about. So we can actually receive forgiveness. And when we receive forgiveness, what happens? It takes away the power of this cycle. It even says in the Bible that the sting of the power of sin is the law. And if you relate that back to Romans chapter 7, there's a law of sin and death, okay? And it's this that tells me I deserve to die, but I don't want to feel that way, so I got to keep on with trying to fix it my own way, which never works. But when we actually give our guilt to somebody that can take it, and Jesus can take that from us, and we don't have to be trapped in this cycle anymore. That's why the Bible says when the Son will set you free, you'll be free indeed. Because Jesus knew about this before. Modern psychologists figured this out, but they don't know what to do with it. But it's right there in the Bible. That's why Paul said, "O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this?" And he said, "I thank God through Jesus Christ, there's no condemnation to those who walk after the Spirit and not after the flesh." And so, once we understand the power of the habits, then we can start to make better choices and have more peace in our life. And I don't want to oversimplify it. It's not a kind of thing where you just say one prayer and like all of your struggles are gone. But this is pattern here, and this is a real thing. And so I'm going to encourage you throughout this program, as we're going to talk about more and more pieces of building your vision for your health and some of the motivations and how to build the motivation and all of that. But and we'll come back to this a couple of times and add in some more pieces. But I want to encourage you to be intentional about your connection with God, and maybe have a discussion with God about the bad habits that you have. And most of you know what those are. So have a talk with God about that and ask Him to set you free, to take away the guilt and the shame. We didn't mention shame, but that's another whole other thing we could talk about. And all of that, to ask Him to take that away, and He will. And here's the really cool thing. Sometimes we don't even know where it all came from. Because it gets really messy. Because I had one more story, this horrible story. A person that I knew actually came to the church looking for help because she was just riddled by guilt. Her son had just been killed in a gang, drug-related shooting in not the town we lived in, but quite a ways away where she had grown up. And she was feeling so guilty because she had started him on a life of drugs. Because when he was born, she was living with this guy, and basically it was like a flop house, and they were just partying and doing drugs, and she was drunk or high most of the time, and that's how her son got into drugs. And so now he was dead. And no surprise, I get talking to her about her childhood. And well, she ran away from home when she was 9 to get away from stuff that was happening at home. She was already an alcoholic at the age of 9. And so she shacked up with some guy and started doing drugs because it was safer than where she came from at home. And so she told me she didn't remember her life from about the age of 12 or 13 until she was getting close to 30. She said she was either like drunk or high or passed out most of that time. Well, and that's when she had her son, was in the middle of that. And like, what do you do with all that? It's a mess. And I mean, I'm giving kind of an extreme example, but the reality is all of our lives are a mess. And the good news is we don't have to sort it all out. We can take all the mess to Jesus. And He knows what we're guilty for and what we're not guilty of, but we feel guilty, and all the other pieces that don't make sense. We take all that to Jesus, let Him sort it out. And He'll forgive us for our part, and the part that belongs to somebody else, He'll make sure it gets put on the right account.
Yeah. Which went on His first?
So I think it's really important. And so I'm going to suggest that I'm going to encourage you over the next few days to think about the choices that you make. Okay? Choices that you make. When you choose something, say it's going to be a choice about what to wear. Are you making that choice based on your feelings at the moment? Based on some plans you have? Your reason? The choice about the words that you say to your spouse or your child or your boss. Your choice about what you eat, what you watch on television. We all make choices all day long. Most of the time, we don't think about why we make those choices. So I want to encourage you for just a few days to think about, okay, I just made a choice. Why did I make that choice? Was it this? Was it this? Was it fear and pain? Or was it some memories that I had, and so my reason said that was the best choice to make? And as you do that, you might be surprised. You might not, but start paying attention to the decision-making process. Okay? And we'll come back to this several times throughout the class. I said Romans 7 and 8, right? Romans 7 and 8. Actually, I should put 8 up here and 7 down here, right? 7 is Satan's chapter and 8 is God's response. Kind of. I'm overgeneralizing, but let's see. I'm going to quickly just give you fill in the blanks here for pages 4 and 5 because we're already going past the time. So, any questions about this, first of all? You got the big picture here. We'll add more to it as we go along, but this is super critical to understand how we make decisions if we're serious about making better decisions and forming better habits for the long run. Now, you can do almost anything for the short run and make it work, but for the long run, we got to get into a good way of making decisions. All right, so keys to lasting change, page 4. Start with why. Of course, that's a famous TED Talk by Simon Sinek, if you haven't heard it. If you're curious, it's worth listening to, but start with why. If you don't have a reason why, then why bother changing? And so you want to know what's your reason why you're changing a habit. So, first question, is it possible? Second question, can I do it? Because some things are possible, but I can't personally do them, right? Mm-hmm. So, and then the third one is it worth the effort? And you have to have you have to believe all three of those things before you're really going to put the effort into making a change. So the answers are scriptural. You probably could fill those in without me giving them to you, right? With God, all things are possible. Number 2, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And the third one, in due season we shall reap if we faint not. That's Galatians chapter 6. The 3 levels of change, I'm going to save that for later. We'll come back to it. So don't let me forget. We'll come back to it later in another lecture. I won't forget, don't worry. The habit cycle. Habit cycle, page 5. Was there a question?
Well, I just 3, the last one. I didn't have it.
You got it?
I got it.
Okay. The habit cycle. So there's a trigger, there's a reward, or a trigger, an action, and a reward. Trigger, action, reward. So that's the cycle, right? So the trigger is I see the chocolate cake, the action is I eat it, and the reward is it tastes really good. And then the trigger and the action and reward, and it happens over and over. Okay, that's just one example. But that could be with any habit. You can break that down into a trigger, action, reward. So sometimes when we're trying to make new habits, we can use the same trigger, or we can use a different one. We can choose a new action. That's the whole idea of creating a new habit, right? So, and then ensure that the reward.
Number 1, what is the second line?
Number 2, choose a new action.
No, the second line of number
Says-
1.
Or
Choose
blank the old one?
Or choose the old one?
Or use it.
Use the old one.
That's a good question. I don't remember now how I had that. Use the same, or you select a new one, or change.
about
You could change, adjust the old one. Okay, ensure that the reward is maintained. So there has to be a reward. If there's not a reward, there's no reason to continue on. And we'll talk more about rewards when we get into goal setting, about the different types of rewards. Yeah, so for filling in the blanks here, it's going to be intrinsic and natural versus extrinsic and contrived. And then affirm your new cycle. So you can say, when I'm hungry, I will eat whole foods, and I will enjoy the flavor that God has made for me. Or whatever. There's any kind of new action you could put there. So when the trigger happens, I will do this action, and then this is the reward that I will experience with that. And then B, 4B, you could tell yourself, I strongly intend to complete this action. It's actually like, whenever you say something, you hear it, and it actually affects your own thinking. Okay? And then change your circumstances to support the new habit. We'll talk about that more later as well. Okay, so that's going to be it. There's more here. You can look through the rest of this stuff about addictions, 12-step programs, all that. I'll just say, if you recognize that you have any kind of serious addiction and you need more help specifically with that, don't be afraid to look for that help. You can reach out to me, or there's lots of resources in this community here. I'll just leave it at that. If you're struggling with addiction, you're going to have to address those in order to have really good health, whatever the addiction is.